Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be able to talk about the work that we've done at the Temple of the Goddess Mut. It's spelled M-U-T, but it's not Mut, it's Mut. And we've been working there almost 20 full years now. And Johns Hopkins has been in collaboration with the Brooklyn Museum expedition for all of that time period. We divide the precinct, which, as you see on the image we have right now, is an area that is literally right in smack dab in the middle of Luxor City, and represents 7 hectares of area, which is owned by the Antiquities Service, and for that reason can't be built upon, thankfully. The Brooklyn Museum has an area that represents the sort of region that is the front part of the precinct. We divide the place almost all the way across like this, and their area here is in the front, and from here all the way, the rest of the precinct is the concession of Johns Hopkins. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is temples generally. Most of you probably are very well aware of things about ancient Egypt, but just to clarify, temples are, in ancient Egypt, did follow certain standards, and architecturally from around 1400 BC down to when the last temples were built in the first centuries AD, they were designed the way you see this one here, which has been cut out to look into it. As you go through a temple, the ground level rises and the roof or ceiling level lowers. And for that reason, you walk through the front of a temple in areas that are designed to be visited by large numbers of people. There are places where festivals can happen, and the people of the town, or at least some of them, could gather on festival days. But in the area marked on this image, starting with the area behind the first hypostyle hall, all of that is an area that was reserved to the pure priests who each and every day had to go into the sacred lake to be bathed and to use natron salts to wash their mouths, etc., in order to approach the sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, where a statue of the god might be housed. And that sanctuary could be very small, probably the size of most of our bedrooms that most of us have today. And inside of that small sanctuary, there would be a small shrine, perhaps made of stone, that would be maybe 8-10 feet in height. And inside of that, there would be another shrine, usually made of wood, gilded, and inside of that, the actual statue of the deity, which could be as small as a foot or 2 in height, and usually made of precious metal. So the architecture definitely reflects the fact that this Holy of Holies was intended to be a place where the god actually gave birth from, came into existence from. And it's almost as if this is an egg that has been in a tiny womb and is being opened up each and every day when the priests open the door to the sanctuary. And then they greet the god and they feed the god and they clothe the god. They even put makeup on the god's face and eyes. And then every 10 days, the Egyptians would have a weekend, as it were, and there would be some sort of festival. But throughout the year, the Egyptians held festivals. And when they did, it meant that the god's statue could be taken out of the sanctuary and brought all the way out into the front courtyards, and then it could be greeted by the people. And on special festivals, you would actually find that the god would then be carried in a small boat, still inside its shrine, from one temple to another temple. And for that reason, the Egyptians devised long areas that we think of now as the Sphinx alleys. These are processional alleys because the god moved from temple to temple. Now, the god of Karnak, many of you who've been to Egypt have probably been to Karnak. Amun-Re, whose image you actually see here, was connected by processional ways to all of the temples in Luxor. That was the Mut Temple, the Khonsu Temple, which was part of Karnak Central, and also the Luxor Temple. Now, the Egyptians actually found this to be so typical and common for them that they would even show the movement of these shrines that held the god on the shrines themselves. And this is the side of the main shrine at Karnak, which was actually built by Alexander the Great's brother, Philip Aridaeus. And you see the king leading a group of priests who are carrying the small shrine placed in the boat, and of course the god is inside of it. So this is a ubiquitous part of Egyptian temple building. And below you can actually see in the aerial shot from Karnak itself, one would actually reach more than one way for processional purposes. So the god might exit this way and get onto an actual ship and be on the Nile, or the god could exit on this southern way and go down the Sphinx Alley to the Mut Temple. At certain festivals, the Opet Festival and the beautiful Feast of the Valley Festival, that's exactly what the god Amun-Re did. And when he did, the statue of the goddess Mut would join Amun-Re, and then the two of them would then travel down the Sphinx Alley and reach further. They would then land at Luxor Temple, which is also a temple for the god Amun-Re. So you can see that in actuality, in ancient Thebes dating from around 1500 BC down to at least 1000 BC, Luxor was, in fact, a religious city set up to be a huge processional space. And the sides of the temples are actually decorated with this, because festivals for the Egyptians were a way of partaking not only in religious activities, but on those days food was dispensed and drink was made available. And the population of the city of Thebes would line the Sphinx alleys, and they would set up small kiosks where food would be created and made and then dispensed to people. So you see all these people. And then up here, you see, this is from the Luxor Temple. You see people beating drums and making music, which accompanied everyone at the time of these festivals. Now, let's talk about the goddess Mut, whose temple we're working at. So she actually appears in two different guises. One, she appears as a female, often wearing a queen's headdress. And sometimes she's also wearing the double crown, which you see her here on the left wearing. The reason for that is because of her earliest nature. The nature of the goddess Mut was actually associated with the sun god. Eventually, she was associated with Amun-Re, and we'll talk about that much more in our fourth meeting. But in her early time, she was associated with the sun god as his daughter and agent in the world. And as such, she often would also appear with a lion head. She was one of what we call the Uraeus goddesses, that is, goddesses who could take the form of a cobra, but a cobra that spit fire at the enemies of the sun god. And her role, in particular, the goddess Mut, was to make sure that what Re had created in the cosmos and on Earth continued. And that meant that one of the things she did was to guarantee the coming of a new Nile flood each year, that she would guarantee that the stars in the sky would continue in their normal routes and would not be disrupted. She was, in fact, in control of time itself in many ways. And in her role of protecting the sun god's creation, she did take this lion form sometimes because she might rage at his enemies. And we'll talk about that again at another time as well. You see her here in that form as a lion on the left. You see her association as well with another goddess, Hathor. Mut is often called in the temple of Mut on inscriptions, Mut Sekhmet Bastet. And she's called by all three names, but when they call her by three names, they only use a singular pronoun to refer to her. So in other words, she is Mut Sekhmet Bastet. And the idea behind that is to indicate the several different ways in which she might perform. That is, she is this goddess who is guaranteeing the creations of Re. She is also someone to punish those who rebel against the sun god, but she can also be very much a domestic deity who takes care of people. So in all three cases, she behaves in this way. And when we see her wearing the double crown, the crown of Upper Egypt and the crown of Lower Egypt, it is because she has combined those crowns that belong to the two Uraeus goddesses, Wadjet and Nekhbet, who represent southern and northern Egypt. Now, the Mut temple is unusual. In fact, it's unique. It lies really on a peninsula surrounded by a crescent-shaped lake. Now, the name of that lake is what gives the name to the site itself, which for the ancient Egyptians was Ishiru. So she was called Mut, the Lady of Ishiru. Now, the etymology of Ishiru is actually a watering hole for lions. And so for that reason, I've placed her lying next to her watering hole where she is protecting and being protected at her home. The Temple of Mut, which we work at, is unfortunately, as you can see, left largely by its foundations. And yet you'll be amazed at how much we can actually show about what was in the temple as we begin to go through this. And you can see here that this peninsula does surround the area and of the temple. And I've indicated some of the most important places that our excavation work has taken place over the years. In particular, we have worked in the second court. We have worked throughout the temple, actually excavating beneath it. And we've begun to work as well in the area sloping down to the sacred lake, as was done in times earlier. So let's talk about the history of excavation, because it's actually, again, quite remarkable. The first work done in the Temple of Mut that is well recorded and documented was done by women in the 19th century. Margaret Benson and Janet Gourlay, two British women, worked at the temple. Margaret from 1895 to 97 and Janet 1896 to 97. Janet was largely responsible for finally publishing the entirety of their excavations, but together they formed a remarkable connection that lasted the rest of their lives, that were cut too short as it happened. But it's really a testament to them that we know as much about the Mut Temple as we do because of their work. Their book, The Temple of Mut and Ashur, appeared in 1899, and here you see a photograph showing Janet Gourlay and Margaret Benson together. These are some images that come from the book, and you see above on the left a view from the rear part of the temple looking back towards the entranceway. If those of you who may have visited the Mut Temple will be able to just see in the background the large Sekhmet statue, which still resides there. Unfortunately, a great deal of other things have been taken away over the years. This view was taken in 1897 after much of the excavation that they did for 3 years had taken place. The one on the right, where they are excavating the area of the slope behind the temple, took place in 1896. Now, one of the things that is so interesting about Margaret Benson to begin with is that she visited Luxor for her health. She was always a very, very frail health, and she had become totally entranced with Luxor and with Egypt generally. So she decided she wanted to excavate, and she became friends with people who were able to help her get permission to do that. And she chose the Mut Temple, having visited there. And this view that you're seeing now is of the first court the end of the season in 1895. Now, I want to point out that where the man is standing in the central axis, when they started work that year, it was completely covered up to almost probably his head. They went through 10 to 12 feet of debris cleaning the first court, because the only things that had really been done up until that time had been in search of Sekhmet or Sekhmet statues, which had been going on since the beginning of the 19th century. But they were dug out because everyone knew that they were set up against walls, and so only the areas up against walls had been dug out, and pretty much nothing else had been. So Benson and Gourlay really were responsible for identifying the pavement levels and bringing the earth down to that level. The statue you see on the left-hand side is one that was actually found just over in the corner. It's actually right off of where we're looking. And it belonged to a man who was active, as I've said here, in the later 15th century BC, a man of great significance, a royal scribe. But we don't know whether that was where he originally had left his statue or not, but that is where they actually found it. Now, as they next year in 1896, they moved into working in the second court. And when they did that, almost immediately they found this large head, which was of a Sekhmet statue. And it is so large that the original statue itself would have been something like 16 feet in height, larger than the one that now sits in the Moot Temple. Most of the pieces of this are still at the temple, but unfortunately not enough to really put it back together very, very well at the moment. And long time ago, the head was taken away, although it has now made its way to the Luxor Museum, so you can see it there when you visit. Now, these are a couple of quotes that came from Janet Gourlay's text, where she talks about the large Sekhmet that is now sitting in the second court. And they put it together. They did a very good job doing that. And very recently it's been refurbished, but I'm not sure that it's actually in as good shape as it was when Benson and Gourlay worked on it. At the same time, they actually found this royal statue, which you see here on the right-hand side. It was lying in two pieces. The head was close to the main axis, and they just happened to see the back of it, or the top of the head actually peering out. And then they found the lower half just a few feet away and were able to put it back up, and it has been there since. Unfortunately, they did not know who it was. Ultimately, they decided to suggest that it was Tutankhamun. We now know that this was originally a statue of Amenhotep III, who is the king who made and dedicated all of the Sekhmet statues from the Moot Temple and from his funerary temple. Certainly in the range of more than 1,000 of these Sekhmet statues were made for Amenhotep III. But this statue, which was made for Amenhotep III and is over life size, it's approximately 10 feet in height, it was retouched and reused by Ramses II, or his son, Mer-Neptah, one or the other, and for that reason, it no longer has the actual facial features, which makes it difficult to identify. Now, one of the things that you find is that Benson and Gourlay do mention that they were almost keeping score as they went through the second court, finding statues here, finding statues there, and each and every day seemed to be marked by what statues they found. And that is in keeping with the way that archaeology was being done by many at that same time. So I wouldn't want to be too harsh on them as being treasure hunters. And I want to point out that in fact, Janet Gourlay had been trained, at least briefly, by Flinders Petrie himself at University College London. So she had a very good idea of what good archaeological method of that time was, and she practiced it, as we'll see in just a moment. In that second court, one of the things that they were very excited about was the finding of this red granite statue, which had belonged to Amenhotep II, but actually had then been redone for Ramses II. And this piece has wandered around through time, but is now to be found in Fort Worth for any of you who go to see the Kimball Museum. Now, one of the things that we'll see is that they moved from working in the second court to working in that area behind the temple itself. So where we saw before the photograph of them doing excavation along the back slope, we know that they started work back there. But But another thing that that Gourlay wanted to do was to really try and think more about how to answer research questions. And she wanted to know who had originally built the Moot Temple. It's a very important question. And she got good advice based on her work with Petrie and with others that she should look for the foundation deposits that were put in when the temple was first built. And they recommended, her experts, that she go to the corners of the back of the corners of the temple and dig. And they did that. They did not find foundation deposits for reasons that we'll talk about at another time, primarily because this section was extension, not the original part of the temple. But when they did, they started to trench a little bit from the corner. And as they began to trench, the irony of Janet Gourlay's desiring to actually apply good archaeological method resulted in their bringing back way more statues, because they discovered trenches A, B, and C, which contained statues galore, as it were. Statues that dated all the way from the Middle Kingdom, 1800 BC, down to the end of the late period, somewhere around 600 BC or 700 BC, perhaps. And these are smaller scaled statues. They are less than life-sized. And Benson and Gourlay actually thought that they had been thrown out of the temple, that's the reason they found them behind the back wall of the temple. But in fact, they were in actual cut trenches, and they were placed in caches that were designed to hold statues that had been deactivated. These were temple statues that had been used, had been dedicated by kings and private persons over hundreds and hundreds of years, but were no longer needed in the temple. There was perhaps crowding, and it was decided to treat them properly and to deactivate them and bury them. And that is a process that we know from temples across Egypt. It was the normal way that you took a statue out of service. The Egyptians really didn't believe in death, in killing. They believed in deactivation. And so even when a person dies, for them, it's a question of simply enabling them to move around if you liked them, or disabling them from moving around if you didn't happen to like them. Now, in the areas behind where we were, the trenches, they continued to work in 1896. And when they did, they found the largest statues that they ever found, also on this slope heading down towards the sacred lake. The single largest one is this statue of Senmut, who was Queen Hatshepsut's greatest helper, his architect, her architect, her steward. Some have always liked to romantically think her lover. We don't have any evidence for that. But this statue was actually lying in the slope covered by dirt. Likewise, these large statues, in the same way, very nearby, and you can see that the one on the left was actually literally underneath Senenmut. And finally, these statues of a man named Mentuemhat, extremely well known to us, who served under King Taharqa of the 25th dynasty and lasted into the 26th dynasty. He was responsible for much of the refashioning of the Moot Temple by these late period kings. And he had his own crypt in the temple, and a number of statues of his were found there, and these two are now in the Egyptian Museum, as were the others that you just saw. Recently, a colleague, Tom Hardwick, put on an exhibition in England at Southport, and it was on this woman named Mrs. Goodison and her circle, and it celebrated a variety of people, including Benson and Gourlay. So you see from their exhibition here, the Moot Temple in the rear with all the Sekhmet statues, and here are two of the late period statues that are still available and in England can be seen by those of you over there. So what are some of the questions that we still have to answer? We don't know, based on the work of Benson and Gourlay, what was the function of the overall Moot precinct or many of its buildings. We still didn't know who the original builders of the temple were. We don't really know or didn't know the relationship between the lion-headed form of the goddess and the anthropomorphic one. We don't know or didn't know why the sacred lake was shaped like a crescent moon. We didn't know how the Temple of Moot relates to the Temple of Amun-Re, which is just up the Sphinx Alley, and the Luxor Temple. Nor did we know how long the Temple of Moot operated and how it changed architecturally and otherwise over time. Okay, so when we started work back in 2001, as I told you that we sort of divided the area with the Brooklyn expedition, but we did have a very specific research agenda, and that has been to really define the area that represented the temple in its earliest forms, to define the size and extent of it during the New Kingdom, somewhere between 1550 and 1000 BC, and to attempt to reconstruct the occupational history of the precinct as well as the temple itself, and finally to do conservation and restoration in the Moot Temple. So those of you who are familiar with us may very well know that we had from 2000 early on until 2015, we had a dig diary called Hopkins in Egypt Today that was is still available and can be reached to look at our daily work. It is an in-process diary. It does not do any interpretation, but it does show you how we worked, where we worked, and in fact also what we found as we went. So if we look at the precinct itself here, when we started work, our main first chore was to really think about the fact that this temple had not been properly mapped in many, many years. That is the precinct itself, not just the temple. So one of the first things we wanted to do was to rectify that. And secondly, we wanted to really work both in the temple and around it, but also in the area behind the sacred lake where there are no standing stone buildings, because we know that temples must be supported by things. People have to eat, people have to drink, and people have to have housing, etc. And so we wanted to have a sense of a much more holistic approach to this temple. So one of the first things we did was to talk about making a new map. Now these days, the way we mapped in 2004 is really antiquity, and almost no one would have done it the way we did, but we have that now. The only map available up until that time was this one, which had been done by the French mission and had been in use by Brooklyn since the 1970s. So we brought out people to actually start building a map directly using Total Station, and that was in 2004. The next thing that we did was to really concentrate on identifying aspects that could define the precinct itself in the New Kingdom. And one of the ways to do that was to go to the gateway of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, which had never been dug to its base. And we dug it out, and then next to it, you can see the extension of the mud brick enclosure wall running south from it. And we were able to follow that mud brick enclosure wall all the way to the rear, and then turn towards the east and follow it again all the way across, and then follow the mounds that are left from it that are still there. Once we were able to do that, we were actually able to find the New Kingdom enclosure wall as considerably smaller than that that exists today. We knew that this front part was not part of the original Mut Temple, and it even has a different name. It's called Ipit or Opit. And it wasn't included until somewhere around 700 BC. But the actual rear enclosure wall has now been clarified, so we can actually talk about what's inside and what's outside of the temple precinct for the New Kingdom period. This is the work we did in 2003 and 4, and what we found is that the enclosure wall, which is right here, actually extended all the way over. So it was perhaps a good 10 meters in width when it was original. It was completely cut down at a certain point, leaving a smaller amount of it. And this is the area that's closest to the lake itself. Here we're standing, taking the picture, looking eastward on top of the enclosure wall, and that area that I just showed you with the mud brick is here. And as you can see that in certain parts of the wall, they actually built rooms that went off of it. And on the inside, they built areas for processing grain. So these numerous rooms actually contained workshops of various sorts. We had pottery making workshops. We had amulet making. This is a mold for making amulets. We had faience making going on as well in these workshops, and a variety of things that represent time-wise in terms of names of kings. Certainly the most of the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1300, is represented. On the inside of the enclosure wall, we find granaries. You see these circular brick areas on the floor, and we have lots and lots of pottery left. These are actually beer jars of various sorts, and certain amphorae that actually have the name of Menkaure or Thutmose III, who was Hatshepsut's co-regent. So these are circular beehive-shaped granaries that ran all the way across from the east to the west behind the enclosure wall. At the far east end, right here where my cursor is, we found the actual area of the bakeries and breweries. And we have a oven area, and the ovens were used over a significant time period and then rebuilt on top of them. And the bakery went back to at least 1600 BC in exactly the same place. You see 4 rooms with mud brick walls that went way down beneath where you see them now in exactly the same orientation. So the temple dependencies of the bakeries actually lasted before the time of the New Kingdom. Left on the floor were actually large mixing bowls that are well known to have been used for the mixing of bread, which you see from Theban tomb paintings, for example. And up here in this example, this is actually one of the flat-topped ovens where they're baking bread on top of it. And here are the same sorts of vessels that we find on the floor of our bakeries. Very nearby where the bakeries were, we actually have an area where the grain is being brought in for the processing that you see in the bakeries. And these are actually mud brick roads that have been laid in to bring in the grain. And you can see that a little bit further here. And right next to it was an area with several column bases, and these column bases would have supported a wooden kiosk where the overseer would have sat to watch the actual processing that we see of the grain. All of this material is extremely well dated by the pottery, which is 18th dynasty, and throughout where we have these very regular walls. However, we know that in addition, these walls are underlain by slightly earlier time periods, so that even in a brick, we could find a small scaraboid that dates to the late Second Intermediate period, somewhere around 1600 BC. And that is true as well of the areas directly underneath the early 18th dynasty walls. Now, what we see is that before the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, there were the bakeries, but some of this area was probably more domestic in that time period, and we found animal shelters and troughs, and you'll even see a large-scale pot still sitting on the floor, again, of late Second Intermediate period date. So this is sort of where we want to stop with this, but for the last 5 minutes, I just want to show you a little bit about what we were doing at the exact same time we were working behind the lake, learning about the bakeries, breweries, and dependencies. We were also working inside. So what were we doing there and how did we approach it? So we were looking at observing the visible remains of earlier forms of the temple. We were looking to study how we could intervene and how we could conserve and consolidate. And we were doing very selective excavation and selective dismantling. So, for example, this is what the second court looked like in 2003. This is what the Mut Temple's front porch looked like, essentially in collapse. And when you went up close to it, its foundation consisted of blocks that actually had decoration on them that belonged recognizably to Hatshepsut's time, around 1470 BC. But look at the blocks beneath this in the foundation. They're literally turning to sand because of the water. We're going to talk about that on another day. So we got permission from the Antiquities Organization to dismantle that front porch wall. And when we did, we removed all of the blocks that it had been built with, as it was built with inscribed material from inside the temple, and so that it could then be rebuilt in a much stronger way. The material that was removed was then placed and carefully covered so that it could be conserved. And we'll show you that later on. And then we rebuilt the front of that front porch. Now, we took the opportunity during this time period to excavate behind this wall. And here you can see it once that excavation had taken place, but we excavated all of that. And here, behind it, right before this was excavated, we started work right here, behind that front wall. And very soon thereafter, 25 centimeters down, we came upon the rear of what turned out not to be a Sekhmet. We thought it would be a Sekhmet statue, but a large statue. And it turned out to be the wife of Amenhotep III, Queen T. And here you see very happy people once we brought the statue up. And she now resides in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. She is represents a life-size statue of the Queen. And what we've learned in the time going by is that she almost certainly was designed to be next to this seated statue that Benson and Gourlay had found. In fact, we found her not 20 feet from where that statue sits, and that it was made to accompany the large Sekhmet statues of the time. So the results that we've got so far since 2000 through 2011 are the following. We know that the enclosure wall of the New Kingdom encloses a smaller area than is now represented. We have far better idea of the functions and large areas of the enclosure. We know that the temple had bakeries, breweries, workshops, etc. We know that the lowest courses of the mud brick bakery walls date earlier than Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, so we have a continuity for this temple. And we know that the levels beneath date to the Second Intermediate period in that area, and in some cases contain animal pens and housing. That's going to bring us, by the way, to finding eventually human remains, which we'll talk about with Salima Ikram on our third week. And all of this led us to know that we needed to do an underground survey so that we could know how much occupation there really is. And so Christian Strutt from the Southampton University will be with us next time to talk about the results of that.